Thank you very much. I would like to warmly thank Melina Mzala and Amy Macri for inviting me to this symposium on nature and human nature in Greek philosophy. Today I would like to talk about Plotinus and more specifically about his doctrine of principles. Actually, the investigation on the nature of principle, that's to say the one, intellect and soul, which are inseparably metaphysical and cosmological principles, constitutes the core of Plotinus' philosophy. Porphyrian testimonies, especially taken from the Vita Plotini and from the final doxography of the recently edited treatise on principles and matter, make clear that the heart of Plotinus' teaching lies in the elaboration of the theory of principles which opposes the doctrine promoted by Atticus or Longinus. Plotinus develops a method of investigation that, unlike Longinus' or Atticus' approach, which draws upon scholastic tradition, is not based on the authority of the ancients. This methodological decision is rooted in a doctrine of the soul that breaks with the interpretation developed by Middle Platonist scholars such as Atticus or Longinus. According to Plotinus, the individual soul, which is the subject of the philosophical inquiry, recapitulates within itself all the divine principles from which it derives. Moreover, by making the soul an entirely intelligible reality, always linked to the intelligible world, Plotinus provides a new way of leading the inquiry on the cosmological principles. So, after these preliminary remarks, here is how I'm going to organize my paper. Firstly, focusing on the Porphyrian testimonies taken from the Vita Plotini and from the treatise on principles and matter, I will provide an analysis of how Plotinus, as opposed to Longinus, constructs a method of investigation which does not rely on the authority of the ancients. Longinus thus applies to Plato's interpretation standards of analysis which are not those that Plotinus recognizes as generally philosophical. According to Plotinus, only the soul, as an entirely intelligible reality, can be considered to be the real starting point of a philosophical inquiry. Secondly, I will provide an overview of the epistemological and ethical consequences of the Plotinian definition of the soul, taken as the last reality belonging to the intelligible realm, focusing especially on the study of Aeneid 3:7. So, my first part. Porphyry's recently edited treatise on principles and matter is devoted to the analysis of principle and especially of matter as a cosmological principle. It is divided into 97 paragraphs, which are organized into 5 main parts. Firstly, a doxography on the nature and number of cosmological principles, ranging from the pre-Platonist to the Hellenistic philosophers. Second, a methodological exposition which serves, as I have shown elsewhere, as a source for Chalcidius' commentary on Plato's Timaeus. Thirdly, a definition of what a principle is. Fourth, a Middle Platonic doxography related to the exegesis of Timaeus 30a, which is intended to illustrate the difference between matter and the primary bodies. And thus, the last part of the text, especially paragraph 73-97, provides an extensive doxography of new Middle Platonist fragments. Among them, we find an account of the teaching of both Longinus and Plotinus, who are presented as the last members of 2 distinct Platonic exegetical chains, each of which contributed to Porphyry's philosophical training. At chapter 95, Porphyry presents an opposition between exegetes like Atticus, Boetus, the lexicographer on Longinus, who supports the doctrine of the temporal generation of the universe, based on the assumption of the existence of a pre-cosmic matter in motion, on those who, following Severus and Plotinus, try to discover its philosophical meaning. What is striking is that the former group brings together exegetes who develop an essentially philological analysis of the Platonic text. More specifically, Porphyry points out a divergence within the Platonic tradition between two ways of interpreting Timaeus 30a and thinking about the nature of the visible that is taken over by the demiurge. While some exegetes following Plutarch and Atticus claim that in this section Plato is dealing with the motion of precosmic matter linked to an irrational soul, the Neoplatonists following Severus hold that motion is a feature of bodies and not of matter. This is my text 1 in the handout. Moreover, if we put these chapters with the Vita Plotini, chapter 14, together side by side, so this is my text 2, it turns out that in acquainting himself with Severus and Atticus' analysis, Plotinus had to develop a hierarchical classification of their interpretation based on the degree of proximity of the truth. Indeed, in the following lines of the Vita Plotini, Porphyry indicates that when Longinus's treatise on principle on the lover of antiquity, peri archon, Longino, caetus philarchaio, were read out to him, Plotinus declared that Longinus was, I quote, a philologist, but no philosopher at all. In my opinion, Plotinus' judgment expresses a broad criticism that extends far beyond a mere observation that Longinus' lexical analysis remains superficial. Indeed, by reading Plato's text literally, Longinus necessarily adopts a certain position on the nature of the principles and situates himself within the context of the philosophical debates. Paul Calligas hypothesizes that Plotinus' remark is connected to the fact that Longinus is following the footsteps of Atticus, who identifies the demiurge with the first god and who places the intelligible form at a lower level, outside the intellect. And no, it is possible to assume that Plotinus also targets his doctrine of precosmic matter in motion. So the debate about the nature and number of Platonic principles does indeed lie at the heart of the polemic between Longinus and Plotinus. And as Michael Edwards points out, I quote, there is a phonetic likeness between the titles peri archon and philarchaios. Arche is a word of many meanings, and the latter work may profess a love of antiquity, as Armstrong indicates, or maybe a defense of the principles expounded in the former. In other words, if we are to defend the doctrine of principle, we must pay close attention to the ancient. A treatise devoted to the explanation of Platonic principle is a treatise that remains rooted in a well-established scholastic tradition. According to Longinus, the Timaeus cosmological doctrine can only be truly understood if we cultivate a certain relationship with the authority of the ancient. Longinus thus applies to Plato's interpretation standards of analysis which are not those that Platonists like Plotinus or Porphyry recognize as truly philosophical. So Longinus, for example, assigns a crucial role to the mnemotechnic retention of the text, that is, to the exegetical attention to verbal turns of phrase, which is linked to a literal reading of the Timaeus. And this approach is exactly the one adopted by Atticus. This allows us to examine more precisely the account given by Porphyry in the Vita Plotini of the discussion of Middle Platonic text that informs Plotinus' elaboration of a new and original interpretation of Plato's doctrine. Indeed, they show how Plotinus' philosophy is indebted to the discussion of theses set out in the Hypnomnemata of the Middle Platonists. This text has largely been lost on their partial rediscovery thanks to the final lexicography of the treatise on principles and matter, opens new avenue in the study of imperial Platonism. This doctrinal opposition overlaps a geographical division between Alexandria, where Plotinus received his training from Ammonius, and Athens, where Atticus and Longinus taught, both defending the existence of a temporal beginning of the universe linked to the existence of a precosmic matter in motion. This motion, according to Atticus and Plutarch, is due to an irrational soul connected to matter. And Plotinus' definition of the soul breaks on both methodological and doctrinal level with this philosophical train of Athenian Platonism. Indeed, not only does he reject the method consisting in relying exclusively on the authority of the ancient, but also he gives a key role to the activity of the individual soul. Indeed, if the individual soul has the capacity to know the cosmological principles of the universe by turning back to itself, it is because it is situated at a specific ontological level into the Plotinian system. Belonging entirely to the intelligible realm, the soul is able to discover within itself the presence of intellect and even of the one when assimilating itself to its origin by acquiring and exercising virtues, that is to say, by purifying itself, turning away from the sensible. So, from this perspective, the discussion on the doxographical text, on the doctrine of the ancient, is no more in the forefront. It is rather used as an exercise to set the soul on the path to the truth, as can be seen very clearly at the beginning of Aeneid 3:7 on eternity on time. This treatise is particularly interesting from this point of view, as eternity and time are defined respectively as the life or the mode of being of intellect and of the world soul. At the beginning of Aeneid 3:7, Plotinus starts with an observation of what happens in the consciousness of everyone who reflects on what eternity and time could be. Everyone can easily speak about them and is convinced to know what they are. However, as we start to inquire more seriously into their nature, we are puzzled by the difficulty to define them properly. Indeed, eternity and time are neither independent substances nor ordinary things. Rather, as the following chapter reveals, eternity and time are modes of being. The former is the way in which the intellect manifests its unity without extension, its atron. And the latter designates the way in which the soul spreads the unity of what it contemplates in the intellect by passing from one content to another. This is my text 3 in the handout. So, in order to reach a definition of these entities, Plotinus presents a specific method that proceeds in 3 steps. Firstly, the soul, which possesses a conception of eternity and a conception of time, and noia, chrono, relates to this in an immediate and non-reflective way. Possessing this notion, the soul can spontaneously bring a pronouncement concerning eternity and time, making time something that relates to the universe, and eternity something that relates to the nature which lasts forever, aidion fusi. However, this does not yet constitute a real definition. The lack of precision of this judgment concerning eternity and time derived from the fact that the right connection have not been established. We confused essential reality with its manifestation. Eternity, which is the life of intellect, is spontaneously associated with perpetual nature, and time is associated with sensible universe, but it's not the right definition. Thus, in the second moment, Plotinus indicates that two further steps have to be taken. First of all, we must critically examine the opinion of those who have already engaged in this inquiry. This step enables us to enrich the definition. Insofar as the soul is not immediately able to provide a complete definition of eternity and time, it must engage in a critical process of reasoning, comparing, and discussing the opinion of the previous thinkers. That said, as the text indicates, to discuss the opinion of the ancient is to establish a hierarchical relationship between them, and Plato appears to be the best guide, and the exegesis of his texts can serve as a reference. So, last step, in search of a true definition, no doctrine or argument from authority suffice to produce an inner understanding, a synthesis of what eternity and time actually are. Nevertheless, the very act of interpreting Plato's texts has an effect on the soul. Indeed, it continuously leads the soul of the seeker to the path towards an even more detailed elaboration of these ennoiai of chronos and eternity. And the goal of the treatise is to lead the soul to discover in itself and by itself the definition of eternity and time in accordance with the ontological level on which it is situated. In order to understand what eternity truly is, one must make oneself eternal, contemplating, I quote, eternity and the eternal by the eternal in oneself. And conversely, in order to understand the nature of time, one must perform a kind of catabasis, bringing one's soul from the intelligible world down to the ontological level where time is generated by the activity of the whole soul. But in all these cases, the individual soul is able to acknowledge these realities because it is not alien to them. It is my text 4 in the handout. The investigating soul experiences that it is able to grasp the nature of the cosmological principle if it turns towards and concentrates its attention to its own interiority. Actually, according to Plotinus,
μετά το...
Okay, sorry. 5 minutes. Okay. According to Plotinus, the inquiry on cosmological principle is linked to a process by which the individual soul becomes aware of its own nature, of the ancestry of its supra-sensible origin. In other words, the individual soul, which investigates cosmological principles, becomes increasingly aware that it is itself akin to the divine principle. This aspect is particularly developed in Aeneid 5.1, entitled by Porphyry on the primary hypothesis. The aim of the treatises is to remind the soul of its dignity and value. From the very first line of the text, Plotinus begins with a question concerning the soul's forgetfulness of the intellect, on this forgetfulness of its own origin. He poses the following question: what is then which has made the soul forget their Father, God, and be ignorant of themselves? In other words, why are the souls so self-forgetful that they come to admire and pursue not their principle, but rather their images, the sensible entities? Here, Plotinus aims to reverse the tendency and to straighten the motion of the self-moving soul in order to make it aware of its divine origin. Epistropse otus, eista enantia, kai ta prota, kai anagoi mekri, to akrotatu, kai henos, kai proto. The philosophical discourse sets the forgetful soul on the path to remembering its connection to the intelligible world, its dignity, and its ancestry, by changing the orientation of its gaze. Plotinus takes over the general view of the figures and formulates in a prescriptive language that the soul had to recognize and to actualize its likeness to the intelligible world. So, from a methodological point of view, this treatise offers a kind of circular structure. Indeed, in the first chapter, Plotinus has established the soul is akin to intellect. But to discover this kinship, the investigating soul must direct its activity towards the intelligible world. And it is my text, text 6 in the handout. And in directing its attention towards the higher level, the soul is able to grasp the nature of the three cosmological and theological principles, that is the one, the intellect, and the soul, as Plotinus indicates in chapter 8. And in a very interesting way, he points out in chapter 10 that, in a way, we must believe that the principles are also in us. This is my text 5. Yes. So Plotinus' statements are clearly paradoxical. Indeed, how could we understand that the intellect or the one are present in us? This cannot mean that their existence is relative to us, because the divine intellect and the one are transcendent principle, and they do not need the individual soul to subsist. But in order to properly understand Plotinus' claim, we must consider another passage taken from Aeneid 1:7, chapter 1, where Plotinus claims that the one is, I quote, possessed by the soul, when soul or intellect has become like it by the process of purification that characterizes the ascent toward the one. But the methodological circularity of the treatise reveals that the journey towards a higher principle has transformed the soul. Actually, to reach intellect on the one, the soul must turn away from the sensible world and gradually become similar to intellect through the practice of virtue. That is, it becomes so unified as possible. So the individual soul, which experiences that it is akin to higher principle, has progressively purified. My conclusion. 2 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay, it's just my conclusion. Okay, thank you. So as to be able to grasp the divine principle. In order to reach its true nature, the soul must go beyond the level of the empirical self. This state is finally reached after having exerted itself to forsake the passion and the solicitation of the embodied life. Only then the soul is able to actualize fully its intellective dimension and coincide with what Plato called the inner man. This is my text 7. So, to briefly conclude, we can safely state that in Plotinus' philosophy, knowledge of cosmological principles is inseparable from the motion by which the soul becomes aware of its true nature, by paying attention to its inner richness. As we saw in part 1, Plotinus distances himself from a certain trend of Athenian Platonism embodied by exegets like Atticus or Longinus. Rather than relying on the authority of the ancient, Plotinus takes the soul as a general starting point of every cosmological inquiry, and the kinship between the individual soul and the divine principles, which is initially postulated by the philosophical discourse, is gradually experienced and discovered by the soul when it turns away from the sensible preoccupation. During the anabasis toward higher principles, the soul is progressively transformed in the sense that it becomes increasingly unified and purified, and is also able to turn its attention to the existence of the higher principle. So there is deep connection between the cosmological investigation on principles and the ethical practice of the soul, which, in turning back towards itself, is at the same time aware of its true supra-sensible nature and is also able to acknowledge the existence of the divine intellect on the one. Thank you very much.